March 8th, 1943. The North Atlantic. 50 sector north, 30 the west. The sea was black. Not the blue-black of deep water under sunlight, but the absolute, lightless black of the Atlantic in winter, cold as iron, vast as death itself. The wind screamed across the surface at 40 knots, whipping foam from the crests of 20-foot swells. Beneath the storm, in the crushing silence of the deep, Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartmann sat hunched over the chart table of U-2-21, his fingers tracing the penciled line of their patrol route. 200 meters down, the pressure hull groaned. Water dripped from a dozen welded seams. The air was thick with the smell of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and fear. 43 men breathed the same stale oxygen, recycled through scrubbers that barely kept the carbon dioxide at bay. They had been submerged for 16 hours. Hartmann had been hunting convoys in these waters for 2 years. He had sunk 11 ships, tankers, freighters, a destroyer. His crew trusted him. The Kriegsmarine had decorated him. Grand Admiral Dönitz himself had called the U-boat crews the lions of the sea. But now, in March of 1943, something had changed. The convoys were still there. The fat merchantmen still wallowed across the Atlantic, laden with American steel and Canadian grain. But they no longer died easily. They no longer scattered in panic when the torpedoes struck, because now they had protection, and that protection came from above. Hartmann heard it first, a faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump transmitted through the water. His sonar operator confirmed it. Aircraft. Twin engine, probably a bomber. Range, 4 kilometers. Bearing, closing. Hartmann's hands tightened on the edge of the table. He had survived air attacks before. The Sunderlands, the Catalinas, they dropped bombs, yes, but bombs were slow, clumsy. If you dove deep enough, fast enough, the bombs would miss. The ocean would swallow the blast. You could wait them out. But this sound was different. And then, without warning, the world exploded. Not above them, not around them, on them. The detonation was not a distant thud. It was a hammer blow against the hull, a crack of thunder that seemed to come from inside Hartmann's skull. The lights went out. Men screamed. The deck tilted violently to starboard as water began to pour through a ruptured seam. Hartmann grabbed the intercom, shouting orders through the chaos, but he already knew. They were hit, not by a bomb, by something else, something that had followed them down into the dark. Historical context. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. From 1939 to 1945, German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes between North America and Britain, hunting the convoys that carried the lifeblood of the Allied war effort: oil, food, ammunition, tanks, aircraft. If Britain was to survive, those convoys had to get through. If Germany was to win, they had to be stopped. For the first 3 years of the war, the U-boats were winning. In 1942 alone, German submarines sank over 1,600 Allied merchant ships, more than 8 million tons of shipping. The Americans called it the Second Happy Time. U-boat crews called it the Golden Age. Kapitänleutnants like Werner Hartmann returned to Lorient and Saint-Nazaire as heroes, their conning towers painted with victory pennants, their crews showered with champagne and medals. But by the spring of 1943, the tide had begun to turn. Allied convoys were no longer easy prey. They traveled in tight formations, protected by destroyer escorts equipped with advanced sonar. Aircraft patrolled the skies above, forcing U-boats to remain submerged for days at a time, and most critically, the Allies had developed a new weapon, one that would break the back of the U-boat fleet in a matter of months. It was not a larger bomb. It was not a faster aircraft. It was a shell that could think. The Mark 24 mine, codenamed Fido by the U.S. Navy, was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo designed to be dropped from aircraft. Developed in secret by the National Defense Research Committee and manufactured by General Electric and Western Electric, it was a technological marvel. A self-guided weapon that could hunt submarines beneath the surface, following the sound of their propellers through the water until it struck home. To the U-boat crews, it was witchcraft. To the Allies, it was the beginning of the end. Emotional contrast. Werner Hartmann had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1938 at the age of 22, filled with the certainty of youth and the romance of the sea. He had watched the newsreels of U-boat victories, the grainy footage of freighters exploding in columns of fire, and he had wanted to be part of it. The U-boat service was elite, selective, only the best were accepted. The training was brutal, the living conditions worse, but Hartmann had endured. He had earned his command. He had earned his Iron Cross. And he had believed, truly believed, that the U-boats were invincible. In the early years, that belief had been justified. The British convoys had been poorly defended, their escorts few and inexperienced. A U-boat could surface at night, slip between the merchant ships, and fire its torpedoes at point-blank range. By the time the escorts reacted, the U-boat was gone, vanished into the darkness like a ghost. Hartmann had done this a dozen times. He had learned to read the sea, to anticipate the enemy's movements, to trust his instincts. He had learned to surface only when safe, to dive only when threatened, to listen for the telltale sound of propellers that signaled a destroyer's approach. He had been taught that the ocean was his ally. That depth was safety, that as long as he stayed below 200 meters, no bomb could reach him. He had been taught wrong, because when the Mark 24 struck U-221, it did not fall from above. It followed. Hartmann had heard the aircraft pass overhead. He had ordered a crash dive, just as he had done 100 times before. The boat had descended smoothly, leveling off at 220 meters. Deep enough that any bomb would detonate uselessly in the water far above. But the explosion had come from behind them, from the stern, and it had been close. So close that the blast had ruptured the pressure hull, flooding the aft torpedo room in seconds. 3 men had drowned before the watertight door could be sealed. As Hartmann fought to bring the crippled submarine back under control, as his crew worked frantically to stop the flooding, he felt something he had never felt before. Not fear. He had felt fear many times, but helplessness, because he did not understand what had hit them. Bombs fell. Torpedoes traveled in straight lines. Depth charges sank and exploded at preset depths. But this had hunted them, and that should not have been possible. Historical evidence. The Mark 24 acoustic torpedo was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allied war effort. Development began in 1941, after British intelligence revealed that German U-boats were becoming increasingly difficult to destroy with conventional depth charges. The problem was simple. By the time an aircraft or escort ship detected a submarine and dropped its weapons, the U-boat had already begun its dive. Bombs and depth charges fell in a predictable pattern, and an experienced commander could often evade them by changing course or diving deeper. What was needed was a weapon that could adapt, one that could adjust its path mid-flight and pursue a maneuvering target. The solution came from the same acoustic technology used in sonar. Engineers at Harvard University and Bell Laboratories designed a small, lightweight torpedo equipped with passive acoustic sensors in its nose. These sensors could detect the sound of a submarine's propellers, the one thing a U-boat could not silence while submerged and underway. Once dropped into the water, the torpedo would activate, listen for the loudest sound source, and steer toward it. The Mark 24 was compact, just 7 feet long, weighing 680 pounds. It carried a 92-pound Torpex warhead, enough to rupture a pressure hull. Its maximum speed was 12 knots, slow by torpedo standards, but faster than a submerged U-boat trying to evade. Its effective range was 15 minutes of runtime, enough to cover nearly 2 miles. The first operational deployment came in May 1943, during the height of the Battle of the Atlantic. On May 14, 1943, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina from VP-84 detected U-1 56 on the surface west of Cape Ortegal, Spain. The U-boat crash dived. The Catalina dropped a Mark 24. 4 minutes later, an oil slick and debris field marked the submarine's grave. Over the next 6 months, the Mark 24 sank 47 U-boats. German commanders were baffled. After-action reports from surviving boats described aerial torpedoes and intelligent bombs that followed evasive maneuvers. One captured officer told Allied interrogators, "We believed the bombs were random. We believed we could escape by diving. But your bombs follow us. How is this possible?" The Allies did not tell them. In fact, the existence of the Mark 24 was so sensitive that even Allied aircrew were forbidden from discussing it. The weapon was referred to only as mine in official reports, hence the designation Mark 24 mine, to obscure its true nature. Pilots were instructed to report kills as probable depth charge attacks, and even after the war, the full details remained classified until 1962. To the U-boat crews, it seemed as though the Allies had developed a weapon that defied the laws of physics. In reality, they had simply turned sound into death. Transformation. ZAT-21 did not sink. Not immediately. Hartmann managed to blow the ballast tanks and bring the crippled submarine to the surface, where his crew abandoned ship in the freezing Atlantic swell. 37 men survived. 6 did not. The boat wallowed for 20 minutes before slipping beneath the waves, her bow rising one final time before vanishing into the black. They were picked up 4 hours later by a British destroyer. Hartmann spent the rest of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Scotland. It was there, in the quiet months of captivity, that he began to understand what had happened. Other U-boat officers arrived in the camp, survivors from boats sunk in the same inexplicable way. They shared stories, they compared notes, and slowly, the truth emerged. The Allies had built a weapon that could hunt them underwater, a weapon that listened. For Hartmann, the realization was crushing, not because he had been defeated, but because he understood what it meant. The U-boat, for all its fearsome reputation, had always relied on one fundamental advantage: invisibility. Once submerged, it was nearly impossible to find. The ocean was vast, dark, and opaque. Even with sonar, an escort ship had to be within a few kilometers to detect a submarine. And once detected, the U-boat could evade, could dive deeper, change course, slip away. But if the Allies could drop a weapon that tracked the U-boat by sound, that followed it through evasive maneuvers, that needed only to be dropped in the general vicinity to find its target, then the ocean was no longer a refuge. It was a trap, and the U-boats were the prey. In the camps, the captured officers spoke in low voices of the war they had left behind. They spoke of boats that never returned, of entire wolf packs vanished without a trace, of patrol zones that had once been safe now turned into killing grounds. By the end of 1943, U-boat losses had reached catastrophic levels. In May alone, Black May, the submariners called it, 43 U-boats were sunk. Grand Admiral Dönitz withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic entirely. The campaign that was supposed to starve Britain into submission had failed, and it had failed in large part because of a 7-foot torpedo that could think. Symbolism. The sound. For the men who fought in the U-boats, sound was everything. In the darkness of the deep, where light did not penetrate and vision was useless, sound became the primary sense. The crew learned to identify the signature of every ship by the rhythm of its propellers, the slow, heavy throb of a freighter, the high-pitched whine of a destroyer, the irregular chatter of a convoy zigzagging through the night. And they learned to fear certain sounds. The ping of active sonar, ASDIC, the British called it, was the sound of being hunted. The whistling descent of a depth charge was the sound of death approaching. But these were sounds they understood, sounds they could evade. The sound of the Mark 24 was different. Survivors described it as a high-pitched whine, like a dentist's drill transmitted through water. It grew louder as it approached, following the boat's every turn, every dive, every desperate attempt to escape. And then, at the moment of impact, there was no sound at all, just the shock wave, the rupture, the inrush of freezing water. The Mark 24 became, in the minds of the U-boat crews, the symbol of a new kind of warfare, one in which the hunter had become the hunted, in which technology had stripped away the ocean's protective darkness, in which there was nowhere left to hide. But the sound carried another meaning as well. It was the sound of American industrial power made audible. The Mark 24 was not a weapon forged by craftsmen in small batches. It was a product of assembly lines, of standardized parts, of mass production. By the end of the war, over 4,000 Mark 24 torpedoes had been manufactured. They were dropped from American-built Catalinas, British-built Sunderlands, Canadian-built Liberators, aircraft produced by the tens of thousands, flown by crews trained in a matter of months. The Germans had U-boats. The Allies had factories. And factories, it turned out, were louder than submarines. Epilogue. By the spring of 1945, the U-boat war was over. Of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned by the Kriegsmarine during the war, 785 were lost. Over 30,000 German submariners went to sea. Nearly 28,000 never returned, a casualty rate of over 75%, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the war. The Mark 24 accounted for only a fraction of those losses. 68 confirmed kills, 33 probables, but its psychological impact was immeasurable. It shattered the myth of U-boat invincibility. It forced the remaining submarines to operate in shallow coastal waters, where they were vulnerable to surface attack. It turned the Atlantic from a battlefield into a graveyard. Werner Hartmann was released from the POW camp in 1946. He returned to Germany to find his hometown in ruins, his family scattered. He never spoke publicly about his service. He never attended U-boat reunions. He worked as a schoolteacher in Hamburg, teaching mathematics to children who had never known a world before the war. But on quiet nights, when the wind came in from the North Sea, he would sometimes stand at the window and listen, and he would remember the sound, the high-pitched whine of a weapon that should not have existed, pursuing him through the dark, relentless, and unstoppable. He would remember the moment he realized that the ocean was no longer his, that the war had been lost not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small defeats, each one delivered by a shell, a torpedo, a bomb produced in quantities his side could never match. The Mark 24 was not a miracle weapon. It was not invincible. It did not win the Battle of the Atlantic alone. But it was a symbol of something larger, the marriage of science and industry, of innovation and mass production, of a nation that could turn ideas into weapons faster than the enemy could adapt. The U-boats had been built for a different kind of war, a war of stealth and cunning, of lone hunters prowling the darkness. They had been designed for an era when quality could triumph over quantity, when a handful of elite crews could hold an empire at bay. But the Atlantic, in the end, was won by the factories of Pittsburgh and Detroit, by the shipyards of Portland and San Diego, by the laboratories of Harvard and MIT. It was won by a democracy that could outthink, outbuild, and outlast any enemy. And when the sound of the Mark 24 echoed through the deep, it carried a message that every submariner came to understand. The ocean is no longer yours. The darkness is no longer safe. We are many, and you are few, and we are listening.